Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're tackling something really significant, maybe a bit unexpected for some.
Oh.
Yeah, the shifting landscape of Christian demographics and missions. Specifically, this idea of re-evangelizing the West.
Right. That's definitely a topic gaining traction.
We've got some excerpts from Krishnasmi Rajendran's work, Re-evangelization of the West and North America. That's our starting point.
It's a solid foundation for this discussion.
So our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to get a handle on the history of global missions.
Okay.
Grasp this huge demographic shift, Christians moving from West to global South.
The big flip.
Exactly. And explore the new ideas popping up about sharing the gospel today, even right here.
In Europe, North America, places once seen as sending nations.
Precisely. Think about this. Could the mission field actually include places like Paris or Toronto now? Let's jump in.
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? And Rajendran's work suggests we need to look back first, understand the history that got us here.
Makes sense. Where do we start?
Well, the text mentions Ralph Winter's framework, his eras of Protestant missions.
All right. Coastal lands.
Then inland.
And finally, the focus on unreached peoples. It helps map it out.
It does. It shows an evolution in strategy and geography.
Okay, so let's unpack that. The 1800s, that was heavily European-led, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Think William Carey in India, Hudson Taylor in China, real pioneers. European energy was key then.
But then things changed in the 1900s.
Definitely a shift. American leadership really came to the fore. People like Cameron Townsend.
Wycliffe Bible Translators founder.
That's him. And Donald McGavran with his focus on, the homogenous unit principle?
Right, reaching groups that are already similar. And Ralph Winter himself, of course. Big influence.
Huge. And we also see figures like Francis Schaeffer setting up Lubbery in Switzerland. What was that, 1955?
Yeah, kind of a response to rising secularism in the West even back then.
Yeah.
A place for deep engagement.
Exactly. And Rajendran really highlights how in the latter half of the 20th century, you see this, explosion of Christian growth in the global South.
While numbers started dropping off in many Western countries, that's the core demographic shift.
It is. But interestingly, that initial growth in the South often leaned heavily on those Western models.
So they were using the blueprints from the West.
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
There was gratitude, a reliance on what had been established. But, it raises questions later about whether those models were always the best fit.
Yeah, because it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it? The source mentions quite a few challenges and criticisms, especially with the whole colonial backdrop.
Oh, absolutely critical. A major issue was locals finding it really hard to separate missionaries from the colonial rulers.
The political padre label, that says a lot.
It really does. This deep-seated feeling that Christianity was, foreign, a Western thing, an imposition even.
That must have created huge barriers to the message itself.
Immense barriers. The text even quotes an Indian politician suggesting Christians should leave. Shows the tension.
And what about those accusations of, bribing people to convert? That sounds pretty bad.
It does. And Richard, quoted in the text, points out that even if hard to prove definitively, those accusations did serious damage to how missionary work was perceived.
Undermined credibility.
Totally. From a Hindu perspective, as the text notes, it often looked like missionaries in the colonial government were just pushing to Christianize everyone, whatever the cost. These historical shadows are long.
And Rajendran says this influence ran deep, right? Even when local indigenous missions started, they often just copied the Western way.
That's a key point he makes. Many global South churches and missions sort of inherited the Western playbook wholesale.
Without maybe stopping to think, does this actually work here?
Exactly. Little independent wrestling with context initially. And the result, the text suggests, was often limited success in reaching non-Christians in large numbers.
Except maybe among certain groups.
Right, often among marginalized or tribal communities. For them, conversion might have seemed like a spiritual path and maybe a way out of social hardship, which raises questions about motivations and the effectiveness of just copying models.
But there were exceptions, people who did it differently.
Oh, yes. The text specifically mentions Brother Bakht Singh in India.
And Watchman Nee in China.
Absolutely. Norman Grubb apparently said Bakht Singh's churches felt closer to the early church than almost anything else he'd seen. That points to the power of, genuinely local expressions of faith.
But they were the exceptions, perhaps.
The text implies that. The more common approach involved, Well, filtering the gospel through foreign ideas, jargon, literature.
Which brings us to this idea of the fantasy of the unreached people. Sounds like a loaded term.
It is. It points to this confusion between sharing faith and, well, trying to civilize people according to Western standards.
Imposing culture alongside faith.
Pretty much. The text uses Don Richardson as an example, but the bigger point is many missionaries struggled to separate the two. There are some pretty stark quotes in the source.
Yeah, I saw those. Terms like untutored non-Aryan tribes, backward and uncivilized races. Jarring stuff.
It really highlights a flawed way of thinking back then, this conflation of evangelism and civilization.
Sobering. Even Samuel Zwemer, a big missions figure, wrestled with it. He warned against civilization first and Christianity afterwards.
Right, he saw the danger that civilization without genuine faith could bring its own problems, maybe even worse ones. It shows the tightrope they walked.
And this mindset, the text argues, shaped missions in places like India, focusing maybe too much on tribal groups.
That's the argument, and then the source lists several sort of general patterns among missionaries before, say, 1950 that we really need to look at critically now.
Okay, like what?
Things like being seen as tangled up with colonial exploitation, assuming mission always meant crossing big geographical borders.
And using terms like pagans. Just insensitive.
Exactly. Also, dismissing local customs, setting up separate mission compounds.
Which could create dependency, right?
Potentially, yes. And maybe too much focus on just preaching, not enough on really contextualizing the message.
Kushwan Singh's point about new Christians adopting Western clothes and styles fits here too. And that militaristic language.
Yeah. Winning souls, spiritual warfare. It can sound aggressive, especially across cultures. It highlights that potential disconnect.
The text also touches briefly on the social gospel in America. How did that play out?
Well, both the more liberal and the evangelical approaches to social action got copied in the Global South. It led to ideas like the holistic gospel.
Which sounds good.
It does, but sometimes it apparently resulted in creating like parallel welfare systems instead of working with local structures, more imported models.
Raises questions about sustainability and integration.
Definitely. Which leads into the role of the local workers, the agents, as the historical documents called them.
Right, the native agents.
Yeah.
Readers, catechists, pastors, even local missionaries. They must have been crucial.
Absolutely essential for the day-to-day work, for establishing things. But it wasn't without its problems.
How so?
Well, sometimes these agents were seen as just hirelings, in it for the pay, wanting to please the Western bosses.
That's tricky.
There's that story about William Goody's watch being stolen by an agent. A single incident, maybe, but it shows how actions could unfortunately reflect badly on everyone.
And the text suggests some missionaries might have used incidents like that to sort of justify keeping control.
Perhaps unintentionally, yeah. Instead of fully empowering local leaders, it could foster dependence, a complex power dynamic.
Which brings us to the emergence of Global South leadership itself. The text asks about this sixth type of global leader. What's that about?
It's questioning the assumption that just because someone, usually from the global north, can raise money, they automatically get global leadership status.
Challenging that financial link to leadership.
Exactly. Stephen Neal's point about the colonial complex, this old idea that Westerners would always be in charge, really hits this.
And that quote from Graham Houghton about the assumption that Indian workers were somehow an inferior order. Ouch.
Painful, isn't it? But you can see how that attitude would just feed the perception that Christianity was a colonial thing, as Richard noted.
But then you have examples like Winslow, realizing, I must become an Indian to the Indians. That sounds like a turning point.
A beautiful illustration of humility, identification, and its positive impact. Ralph Winter's later idea of the missionary stages, pioneer, parent, partner, participant, offers a better model, right?
Moving towards genuine partnership.
That's the goal. The emphasis needs to be on dignity for Global South leaders, encouraging their own thinking, their strategic leadership.
Without the Global North pulling financial strength.
Precisely. And it's striking, isn't it, that statistic about 90% of Christian books still coming from the Global North.
Yeah, definitely a need for more voices, more perspectives from the South to be heard globally.
Though it is positive that more Global South leaders are being included in international organizations now.
This shift in leadership ties into the whole idea of re-evangelizing the West, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The core reality, as the text stresses, is that the center of gravity for Christianity has shifted south. That changes everything.
How we read theology, how we see the global church.
And the world itself has changed dramatically. Colonialism is over, nations are independent, there's national pride, cultural revival.
And sometimes A reaction against anything that smells of the colonial past, which can include Christianity, unfortunately.
Which is where the Engel scale comes in. It redefines unreached.
Oh, so.
It's not just about the poor in developing countries anymore. It includes people in, say, London or Los Angeles who are miles away from faith, regardless of their wealth. It's about spiritual distance anywhere.
Okay, so it's a spectrum of belief or openness.
Right. And the goal is moving people along that scale towards faith and discipleship. But the text notes that historically, a lot of effort went into the -2 to +3 range people already somewhat open.
Less focus on those really far off, the -7 to 0 range.
Comparatively less, yes. This really challenges the old ways of thinking about mission strategy.
Like the unoccupied fields or the 1040 window.
Exactly. The 1040 window was influential, no doubt, but it noticeably left out Europe and the Americas.
Which seems odd, given John 3:16, for God so loved the world.
Right. The text explains why it was popular theology strategy at the time, good marketing maybe, but in today's globalized world, it feels limited.
So the thinking is shifting.
Yes, towards unengaged peoples rather than just geographically unreached. And diaspora missions are becoming huge.
You mean like Koreans doing mission work in the U.S.?
Or Nigerians planting churches in the UK. Yes.
Yeah.
The mission field is everywhere now, often right next door.
And the evidence for decline in the West is pretty stark. Empty churches being sold.
Even becoming bars or pubs in England, apparently. It's a powerful image. And the attendance stats for the US, France, UK, Australia, they tell a similar story.
So there's a clear need for a revised plan for the West.
Absolutely. And the text points out that God raises new movements. Think of all those groups that sprang up mid-20th century, IVP, YFC, OM, YWAM navigators.
A fresh wave of energy.
And it continues. OM ships, people like Daniel Che, the Korean guy training Brits. It shows this ongoing adaptation. Ralph Winters said, God raises new movements when old ones decline. Hopeful, isn't it?
It is. And this leads to the opportunity with diaspora groups. Diaspora nations are on our doorsteps. I like that phrase.
It captures it perfectly. The Western Church can partner with these communities, learn from them. A Nigerian pastor's reaching Nigerians in London, Sri Lankans building communities elsewhere.
And all the global movement, refugees, students, migrants, it's created new pathways for the gospel.
Paradoxically, yes. Huge displacement, but also huge opportunities for cross-cultural connection.
That YWAM plan in San Francisco targeting diaspora groups, that sounds strategic.
Very relevant for cities everywhere, really. Europe, North America, and think about U.S. history. Earlier, European migrations completely changed its religious landscape. It happens.
And the number of international students, like in India, huge mission field right there.
Massive Bangalore, Chennai. A unique chance for the Indian church. The IOM stats show how big global migration is. China, India are huge sources.
There's that example of the Korean diaspora boosting U.S.-Korea trade. Migration builds bridges.
It does. And spiritually, too, look at Baksing. Converted in Canada, goes back to India, starts countless churches. Incredible ripple effect from diaspora.
Given money is often tighter, especially in the global south, the text really pushes for tent-making models. Like the Filipino model.
Yeah, self-supporting missionaries. They work regular jobs in the community. It's practical, sustainable. Apparently Hungary is adopting this model too.
And the Nadiad model, getting jobs within the community to be seen as part of it.
Another great example of being integrated, not separate. It's about creative thinking. Business as missions, J-clubs, contextualized churches, trying new things.
So the big picture is the lines are blurred now. Sending, receiving, it's happening everywhere.
That's the core idea, ethne to ethne, people to people. Global North, Global South, both sending, both receiving. It means we have to ditch those old monocultural mindsets.
And really commit to local leaders. Learn from past mistakes.
Absolutely. Adapt, be relevant. And there's this call to equip every believer, not just pastors.
Right. Equipping people in arts, business, education, government. Wherever they are, like that Sang Parivar strategy in India, but for Christian witness.
An interesting parallel, yes. It challenges the old Bible college model that maybe just train people for a mission compound world that doesn't really exist anymore.
So a revolution in training is needed.
The text calls for it. Focus on placing committed followers inside communities, applying the gospel to all of life.
Leading to real transformation that fits the culture.
Exactly. And crucially, remembering to care for the leaders and families doing this vital work. It's not just about strategy, it's about people.
So wrapping this deep dive up, we've seen this huge shift, west to global south.
We've looked at the historical baggage, the challenges, especially the colonial links.
And now this need to re-engage the West, rethink mission field, find new ways.
The core message stays the same, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Jesus, the gospel, that's unchanging.
But how we share it in this constantly changing world that needs innovation.
Constant reinvention, adaptation.
So the thought we leave you with is this. How has this maybe challenged your idea of the mission field? What new ways might be needed right where you are or beyond?
It really is a call for, well, a paradigm shift for all of us in how we see reaching all people.
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Thank you.